Mhm.
because God could have created a beginningless universe if he wanted to. Um, I'm now not convinced that that's right. And
Welcome, everyone, to Thinking with Anderson. I'm here today with Professor Robert Koons from UT Austin. And this is one of the people that I studied in graduate school. So there's always these kinds
oh,
of persons who are heroes, and you can't wait to meet them in person. And now we're talking here. And Rob and I, over the years since graduate school, we've crossed paths a number of times. But
yeah,
I want to let everyone know that especially your articles on cosmological argument and proof of God's existence, really important and really refreshing when I was a graduate student studying otherwise with all atheists.
yeah. Well, that's very kind of you to say, and that makes me feel quite old.
Yeah, I
So,
shouldn't have put it that way, huh? No,
well, that
you're
was it was early work of mine. So,
yeah, real early. Yeah, you're publishing when you're
yeah,
quite young. So
yeah.
yeah, and then we
No, it's
both
interesting how the cosmological argument in particular, I think, has experienced a real renaissance in the
Mhm.
last 25 years or so.
Yep,
And when I first started writing about it, fellow Christian philosophers would give me the incredulous stare.
really.
What? Really? You're trying to prove God's existence? So yeah, it's encouraging to see it come
Yeah.
along.
Well, what would they be doing since you're mentioning they're Christian philosophers? Were
Yeah,
they working more within like a properly basic belief framework?
probably. Yeah, yeah. As far as they had a sophisticated epistemology, yeah. I remember George Mavrodes, who's a really good philosopher, was Christian, and I gave one of my early versions of the cosmological argument when he was in the audience, and he just couldn't believe that I was trying to prove God's existence. He thought, we've done that, we tried that, didn't work. Let's
Didn't
move
work.
on. Let's do something
Wow.
else. But fortunately, I didn't listen to him.
Yeah, yeah, unfortunate for all of us. And that's amazing. In other words, because you shared a key detail, it wasn't we've done that. Now let's move on. We already invented the wheel. Let's move on. It's we
Yeah,
tried that and
we tried it
failed.
and it failed. Yeah, that
Tell,
was
tell
the
us a little bit about that. People watching might not know why he thinks that we failed.
yeah. Well, in mid 20th century philosophy, early to mid 20th century analytic philosophy, English speaking philosophy, it was really dominated by what we call logical positivism or logical empiricism. And so for a long time, the question was not only couldn't we prove God's existence, but did it even make sense to say that God existed?
Hmm.
What could that possibly mean if you couldn't verify it in a laboratory? You couldn't set
Yeah.
up a test in the laboratory to see whether God existed or not. Therefore, it was meaningless. That was the claim. And even after that had passed, there was still a very strongly, I would say, almost Humean kind of
Hmm.
epistemology that everybody was taking for granted. And the other thing that was, I think, relevant here, well, you might know that there was a famous debate between Bertrand Russell and Frederick Copleston.
Hmm.
Copleston was a Catholic philosopher, very good historian of philosophy, and of course Bertrand Russell, very famous
Hmm.
early analytic philosopher. And I remember, well, in that debate, one thing that's very notable is that Russell, again presents this kind of Humean empiricism, but also says, look, causation. We don't need causation in philosophy anymore. We've shown that that's obsolete. It's like the monarchy in Britain. We sort of have it around, but we don't really need it anymore. So we can get rid of causation. And also, he said, there's no such thing as the cosmos anyway. So to talk about the cause of the cosmos is meaningless as well. And also modality. So the whole idea of possibility and necessity, that makes no sense either, according to Russell, right? So that was a very common view in mid 20th century. And so, you take away the cosmos, you take away causation, you take away possibility and necessity, and you and
Yeah.
you and you assume a kind of Humean empiricism. Well, it's going to be pretty tough to prove
Hmm.
God's existence. So what we did have early on was Richard Swinburne's kind of project,
Hmm.
and that influenced me a lot. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. But it was definitely
And tell the
operating in some
audience about
ways.
that. They might
Yeah.
watch, they might say, "What's Swinburne's project?"
Yeah, so Swinburne gives arguments for God's existence that treats it as a kind of scientific hypothesis,
Hmm.
and then gathers together, I would say, empirical evidence of a kind to show that we can increase the probability of God's
Hmm.
existence relative to this evidence. So I think there's some value to that, right? So he points. I mean, in a way, it was some very early versions of fine-tuning kind of
Hmm.
arguments in Swinburne. That here are these coincidences that nature seems to be so regular and predictable and well adapted for the origin of life, that needs some sort of explanation. And Swinburne says that, and Swinburne was quite famous early on for doing some work in philosophy of science, which was in many ways the core discipline for analytic philosophy in the mid 20th century.
Yeah.
And he makes the case there that in science we look for simple hypotheses to
Hmm.
explain coincidences among complex data. So that was the kind of project, to look at all of the complexity of the contingent world of our created world, our finite world, and to argue that God is the simplest explanation of all of that. I think the part of it that I think is most effective really was his argument that we find that the universe, although very, very large and complex, obeys really, really simple laws.
Hmm.
And that itself is a sort of striking thing, and calls for some sort of explanation. And he
Hmm.
argues, that God provides the best explanation for that. So that, I mean, it's a good project. It's very different from the classical theistic proofs that you get from Plato,
Yeah.
Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, Leibniz, and so on,
Yeah.
which were much more metaphysical, you might
Hmm.
say. Didn't rely on probability theory or
Yeah.
Bayes' theorem or anything like that, right?
Yep.
And didn't presuppose the kind of empiricist epistemology in a way that
Yeah.
Swinburne was presupposing. And you get a very different picture of God actually as a result,
Yeah. Well,
right?
that's what happens, right?
Yeah,
You end up with a potentially changeable or anthropomorphic God.
definitely changeable for
Hmm.
Swinburne, right?
Yeah.
And a God whose necessity just consists in the fact that he's always been around,
Yeah.
and there's no sort of deeper necessity there. And yeah, and you get this in other people in that period as well, even if they weren't part of Swinburne's project, like Plantinga. God is just a human person writ large, so to
Yeah.
speak, right? Without our limitations.
And
Um,
what's fascinating to me, I'm actually finishing up a commentary on David Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion. It should be
yeah.
out later this week.
Oh,
And
great.
he anticipates the character Cleanthes is the view you're
Yeah.
describing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cleanthes is the scientific guy who's investigating the universe, and he comes up
Yeah.
with a finite deity.
Yeah. No, right, exactly. So it's very Swinburnian in that sense.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the other thing. I mean, most people in philosophy these days, if you talk about natural theology or proving
Hmm.
God's existence, they'll say Hume, Kant. It's
Yeah,
over, right?
it's all done.
Hume showed he couldn't do it. Kant showed he couldn't do it. And the ironic thing there is, and I'm sure you know this, right? That if you look at their works, their arguments against these proofs depend on an epistemology that no one believes now. No one
Yeah,
takes seriously, right?
yeah.
And,
That's what's amazing. Yeah. So
a
the very,
radical empiricism, right?
yep,
That would undermine any kind of science, for instance.
yep,
And that didn't bother them, of course.
yeah,
At least in Kant's case, I mean, science is relegated to toward organizing our experiences and
yeah,
our appearances. It has nothing to do with the real world,
yeah,
and no one really believes that anymore. But nonetheless, the refutations of the
yeah.
classical arguments that they provided are still people still think that's the final word. So
Yeah. Well, even what you just said about Russell, there's probably if anyone knows about him, they know that anecdote about him saying if he was to meet God, he would
yeah,
say not enough evidence.
yeah, right,
But
right,
then
exactly.
the story you just shared is that he's undermined all potential for the kinds of evidence.
Yeah,
So what was he
yeah,
expecting?
right. Well, exactly. And then the other thing that's sort of ironic is that in the course of late 20th century analytical philosophy, all the things that Russell talked about have been revived. So modality,
Mm.
possibility, necessity,
Yeah.
it's all over the place. Causation, there's a causal theory of everything now,
Yep.
rightly so, I think. No one denies there's such a thing as the cosmos. There's a whole field called
Yeah.
cosmology that studies
Yeah.
it. So again, people would, if they don't refer to Russell, or if they don't refer to Hume or Kant, they'll refer to Russell. But
Hmm.
again, nobody
Hmm.
actually accepts the premises that Russell's relying on there
Yeah.
in his
Well,
refutation.
and the debate between him and Copleston is really good. I believe it's on the internet, the
Oh
audio
yeah,
of it, so anyone can listen to it. But I remember one of my graduate professors, he was a great guy, but he was focused, his thing was Carnap and Quine. They had
yeah,
pretty much finished off philosophy, and he was
yeah,
the
right.
worldwide expert on Carnap.
Yeah, right,
And
right.
I brought up in class one day, I said something like the following, well, this reminds me of the Russell Copleston debate, but Copleston won that debate. And
Hmm.
he looked at me like, "You think he won?" And it made me think,
Yeah.
and as a student, I kind of thought back, I wonder if you could listen to that debate and think Russell won. I suppose you could, given
Yeah.
your
Oh,
your
yeah.
assumptions.
A lot of people do. Yeah. But I think if one were to listen to it again, yeah, if one were to listen to it today, though, I think very few of my atheist colleagues would accept any of the premises that Russell relies on.
Yeah,
And so it would be they would have to come up with a whole new line.
yeah. So you were saying you were then influenced by Swinburne.
Mhm.
Where'd you go from there?
Well, I guess the next major influence would be Thomas Aquinas. Just started. I was actually teaching some logic courses at UT, and one of the things I like to do is to find real world texts that you can then
Hmm.
extract logical structure from. And I thought, well, like, let's make it easy for myself. I'll use Thomas Aquinas because there's syllogistic arguments all over the place just below the surface. So it's a nice exercise for students. So I said, well, I'll do the five ways. And of course, I'd been exposed to the five ways as an undergraduate philosophy major, and you spend maybe one lecture on them and why they're really bad arguments, and so I looked at them again. I thought, well, because at the time I was working on the whole theory of causation, formal theories of causation, and of course that plays a big role in the five ways. And I realized, well, actually these are pretty interesting arguments. They're not obviously bad arguments at all. And so that got me looking at the whole area and realizing again that there was a lot more to be said for it. So I did my first paper on this in 1997
Okay.
in the American Philosophical
But you were
Quarterly.
already hired at
Um,
UT by then.
yeah, yeah, I was hired in '87, so that was
So
about 10 years later.
what took you in the direction of philosophy of religion then as a student?
Right. Well, I mean, I'd grown up in a Christian home and always been interested in Christianity, obviously as a believer,
Mhm.
and when I was studying philosophy. At one point, I thought, gee, all these people around me are atheists. Maybe this is not a good thing for my faith to study philosophy, right? And I had a great uncle who said, "You're going to go to hell if you study philosophy." So I was thinking about it, and I thought, well, um, still, if there really is a God, I'll just trust him that he'll show me how I can answer these
Hmm.
killer objections if there are any.
Good.
I'm
Yeah.
not sure if that was the right attitude or not. Looking back, it was maybe a little presumptuous of me, but in
Hmm.
any case, that's what I did. And so I mean, I spent maybe what is it now, 50 years, right, looking for this killer argument that all my colleagues are relying on that
Hmm.
shows that Christianity is false and God doesn't exist. There is no such argument, right? I
Yeah.
mean, they're really terrible when you look at them. So I mean, I've had this interest now. I think my approach was probably more fideistic or presuppositional or
Hmm.
Plantingan or something
Okay.
that we didn't really need to prove God's existence. It's just sort of an obvious fact that God
Yeah.
exists, right? Um, and I still think that, I guess, right? Although I like the way Aquinas puts it, that you have what he calls a confused knowledge of God that's sort of
Hmm.
implanted in us, right? There's a supreme being who made the world and has moral standards and so on. I do
Yeah.
think you know all that more or less innately, so to speak. Um, but when you're doing theology, I guess we would like to have a slightly more precise
Yeah.
idea if we can. And there, looking at arguments is really, really very helpful. And
Yeah. Well,
also, I also
and,
think it also, I also think it was kind of therapeutic. So if somebody, for some
yeah.
reason, their mind is damaged in such a way that they don't see that God exists, obviously, arguments can help in some cases, I think.
Yeah, that's right. And it's interesting that you said there you never did find the killer argument that shows, Christianity is false.
Right.
But on the flip side of that is, and tell me if this has been your experience, but my experience is the most intellectual atheists I know, when you press them on why they're atheists, it starts off with big things like, well, maybe gravity organized the universe from nothing. But it always actually comes down to some version of the problem of evil, which is
Mhm.
very adolescent in its formulation. So it comes down to just,
Right.
I don't like God. Why not? Maybe
Yeah.
some Christians were rude to me when I was a high schooler, something like that.
Yeah.
And it's not any more sophisticated than the atheist down at the pub.
No, that's right. That's right. Yeah. I mean, most of my friends and colleagues who are atheists have not spent 10 minutes really thinking
Yeah.
about it. because everybody else knows it too, right? Knows
Yeah.
it, right? So it's a very cultural thing,
Yeah.
really,
You don't have to
I think.
question it. Yeah. Well,
And
that's where you and I have been in kind of the same boat of, although I'm very envious of you, I have to watch myself to not sin when I think about you and Dan Bonevac,
yeah,
because you've got a great colleague to work with over there.
yeah, no, it helps a lot to have two or three of us. And we got this new School of Civic Leadership that
Yeah, that's right.
is being created, and so we're
Because Frank is there. Is that he in
hiring
that one?
more.
Frank Beckwith?
No, no, he's at
Oh,
Baylor.
he's a Baylor. I'm sorry. Yeah,
So,
sorry.
so we've got that's another advantage. We've got some
Yeah.
really good people just up the road in
Yeah,
Baylor.
I sometimes
Alex
confuse
Cruz
who's
and
where because I've had
yeah,
graduate student friends who go to one or the other, but then they get to take classes with you guys. They might come down from Baylor and take a class or
yeah,
something.
yeah. Alex Cruz and I have done a couple of seminars together.
Yeah, that's pretty neat.
Yeah,
Good.
that was great. Yeah,
So that's interesting. You start off kind of presuppositional, you said. Was that like a Van Tillian presuppositionalism?
roughly, yeah. So I'd read some Francis Schaeffer and things like that as
Hmm.
in high school and even really in college days, which was again very helpful. It helped me to see that Christian theology has answers for these deep
Mm.
questions, philosophical questions.
Yeah.
And so it's not philosophy as such is not a bad thing.
Hmm.
So that was
Yeah, same
helpful.
for me. That he was influential about that same age for me, high school,
Yeah,
and just seeing the breadth of what he did intellectually. Even if people critique him and say, "Well, he didn't get this or that detail right," but it wasn't so much
yeah,
that as it was
yeah,
the idea of engaging with all the intellectual areas.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I thought his history of philosophy, in at a high level of abstraction was pretty good,
Yeah,
actually.
yeah,
And he was wrong on one or two points. I thought he was wrong on Thomas Aquinas and wrong on Kierkegaard. I thought those are the two
mhm.
that he didn't get right. But everybody else, I thought, yeah, he had the right
Yeah.
idea.
That level of it, and then yeah. So let's get that. You came down to Thomas Aquinas, the five ways, and also one of the objections from early on from George Mavrodes was you don't need to prove God exists because we failed.
Yeah,
But one of the ones I hear the most from other Christians is you don't need to prove God exists because everyone knows that. Their problem is the will.
yeah,
But I think Aquinas, on that point of voluntarism and intellectualism, is an intellectualist. He would say also our will is fallen. And you said the same thing a moment ago to say that they sort of have a confused knowledge of God.
yeah. Right, right. Yeah, I mean, it's a complex interplay, I think, between will and intellect. Um, and the fall affects both in a way that's sometimes hard to extricate. Um, but yeah, if you grow up in a world in a society where people treat each other really badly, and maybe you don't get to enjoy nature much, you're stuck in a mine most of the time or something,
Yeah.
right? It can be tough to for that natural knowledge of God to express itself, and not necessarily the individual's fault. I don't think, at least not entirely. There's lots of social sort of corporate
Yeah.
sin going on here as well.
Brought up in a whole fallen
Hmm.
world, right? Everything. Uh, Hume used the phrase, "The world is full of misery and wickedness."
Yeah, that's that's one place where he stumbled into the truth.
Yeah, he got it on accident. But so then you saw when you started going over the five ways in logic class. Tell us what stood out about them.
Well, as I said, I've been working on the theory of causation and just trying to figure out, well, what are some of the basic principles that you should assume. And I thought that was pretty plausible that causation was a partial ordering, so you didn't have circular causation, for instance, and didn't have infinite regresses. That wouldn't make sense. And then, of course, Thomas relies on all that, so it was easy to kind of slot some of the work I'd done into his argument there. And the thing the question that he raised for me that I hadn't really thought much about was the scope of a causal principle. That is, what needs to be caused? What should we
Hmm.
expect to be caused? Right? And that's something that is just now getting some more attention. Sometimes it's put under the principle of sufficient reason.
Yeah.
Um, I'm not real happy with that label, actually. I prefer to think of it in terms of universal causation.
Yeah. Tell us
So
why.
that,
That's interesting.
yeah. Well, why do I think that exactly? Well,
Because I
partly
do know that's one of the
because,
favorites of graduate professors, atheist graduate professors, is to undo the principle of sufficient reason for their Christian students.
yeah, right, right. Yeah, well, I take the principle of sufficient reason in some ways to be a much broader principle than the principle of causation. So the principle of causation would say, this is the way I would formulate it. Things that are natural, by which I mean that could be caused, that are causable, are caused, are in
Yeah.
fact caused. Uncausable things don't just happen without a
Yeah.
cause, right? So that would include things like you and me and what we call substances in Aristotelian philosophy, but also events and attributes of things and so on. Those would also count as things in a sense. So it's a bit broader than just individual concrete things.
Yeah.
But still, it's not quite as broad as the principle of sufficient reason, which says anything that's true, any proposition that's true, right, has to have a sufficient reason, right? So that's pretty broad, right? I mean, it gets you into some tough questions about, 2 + 2 being 4 and so on, right? I mean,
Yeah, like
whether you
infinite
think,
regress problem of
well,
everything. This needs proof, and so the thing you proved it with needs proof, and all the way
right,
back.
right, exactly, yeah. There are problems about like the proposition that every proposition is true or false, for
Hmm.
instance, right? That proposition sort of refers to itself in a way,
Yeah.
right? Because
Right.
it's one
Yeah.
of the propositions that's either true or false. And so, yeah, you get into some circularity kind of problems. The other thing that's potentially worrying about it is if you say it's a principle of sufficient reason, that suggests that the reason is sufficient to necessitate the thing it's a reason for. So that if the reason is there, necessarily the thing follows,
Hmm.
right? And that doesn't hold in the realm of causation necessarily,
Yeah. Right.
right? So God is the cause of the universe, but God's existence does not entail the existence of the universe.
Right. That's a good point.
God
Yeah.
can cause it or not, depending on whether he wants to or not, right?
Yeah.
Just as I can cause, the pin to drop. Um,
Hmm.
it's not that my having that power somehow necessitates that the pin will drop,
Hmm.
right? It's just one of the things that could happen given the powers that I have.
Yeah. And this kind of also is a way to answer Richard Dawkins. He's well known for saying, if a Christian ever asks you where the universe came from, ask them where'd God come from. And he
Yeah,
thinks that's kind of like a drop the mic moment instead of a,
I know.
boy, you just made a fool of yourself moment.
Well, exactly. I mean, philosophers working in this area have realized that's the big question from the beginning, right?
Yep.
So no one ever proposed that absolutely everything has a cause,
Yeah.
right? Well, I don't say that. Spinoza may have said that, but I wouldn't say that because that forces you to say that God caused himself, which I don't think
Yeah.
makes any sense, right?
Yeah.
So it's not that everything has a cause. I would say everything that's causable has a cause,
Right. Yeah.
right?
Good.
And that forces you to something uncausable, right?
Hmm.
And then you can investigate what that means. What does it mean for something to be really, truly uncausable? And
Hmm.
then you can get a lot of interesting theology flows from that,
Yeah,
I
sure
think.
does.
Yeah.
Well, and so that got you back into the five ways, or you saw that, at least you saw the value of them because of that. Now, these have been dismissed because of objections from Hume and Kant,
Yeah.
but also maybe some of the other objections I mentioned, like, well, we don't really need to prove God exists because everyone knows that.
Yeah. There's part of that as well. That's right. And there was a complicated history too, where um, actually Thomas himself was pretty early on eclipsed by Duns Scotus,
Hmm.
a generation
Yeah,
a
tell us about
generation
that too.
later. Um, well, okay, so Duns Scotus was an English philosopher about a generation later than Aquinas,
Mhm.
and I mean he was a brilliant guy, and he wrote for other philosophers at a very high level, right? Whereas Thomas is always trying to write. Summa Theologia is supposed to be an introductory textbook for science
Yeah.
theology. It's probably the most challenging introductory textbook ever. But nonetheless, I mean, he's trying hard not to be excessively technical and
Hmm.
abstruse. Scotus doesn't care about that. He's technical abstruse as he thinks he needs to be, which is fine. But he does abandon several of the five ways. First way, fifth way, drop out altogether. Third way, really, as well. So he ends up with just the second and fourth way.
What
Very
and tell
interesting.
us what about his philosophy made that happen?
Right. So one of the things that happens in the course of the Middle Ages is that as people do more professional philosophy, the standards for what counts as proof keep going up.
Hmm.
Right? And so they find the arguments that Thomas gave sort of wanting given these new standards. And so they're trying to produce more refined arguments that will stand up to objections. So that which is a good thing really.
Hmm.
But there's always the danger that in the process of doing that you will abandon strategies that could have been developed
Yeah.
to that same standard, right? But just weren't, and so
Hmm.
they just drop away because no one did them, right? No one
Yeah.
worked on them. So there's a kind of narrowing of the focus, I would say,
Yeah.
more or less to the second way, to the idea that there has to be a first cause of everything.
Yep. That's the
Um,
one everyone knows probably.
yeah, and which is, arguably the most important of the five ways. But still, there's a I mean, actually, when I started working on this, I was really focused just on the second way myself,
Hmm.
right? So it's only very recently that I've come to think that the first and third and fourth, fifth ways are actually also really good.
Yeah.
I generally thought, yeah, they're not really that great, but because I've been doing a lot more work. I've been a lot more thought about Aristotle's system as a whole,
Yeah.
and you really have to understand that to understand Thomas's arguments.
Yep. I want to come to
Uh,
that too, because that's a really important part. You've done your work on
and the other
Aristotle.
thing that's helpful here is that there's been quite a migration again of 21st century analytic philosophy towards Aristotle,
Yep.
all right across the board.
Well, he's analytic. The
Ethics,
thing is,
political.
he's very analytic.
Yes, yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
yeah, and when I was in grad school, people say, "Oh yeah, Aristotle's great, wonderful," but we're way beyond that,
Yeah.
and you don't hear that anymore. It's like instead it's like, well, what did Aristotle think about this? Let's figure it
Yeah.
out.
Yep.
And so there's on the whole idea of well, the whole idea of essences, that
Hmm.
things have essences, and that's important to explaining what's possible, what isn't.
Hmm.
I mean, again, 40, 50 years ago, no one took that seriously.
Yeah.
Now everybody does, pretty much,
Yeah.
thanks to Saul Kripke and others, and Kit Fine. So that's been huge. Teleology, everybody thought, the idea that things in nature happen for a reason, for a purpose, for a goal.
Yeah.
They thought that was obviously outdated
Oh yeah.
science.
Even
Now,
even when I was a graduate student, that was
yeah,
completely outdated.
yeah, people would make fun of it. Oh, he thinks the rock desires to go to the center of the universe.
Hmm.
Ridiculous.
Yeah.
Which of course is not what he thought. But now, teleology is all over the place again. So a lot of the things that people had dismissed are coming back. Yeah, let's see. I was trying to think. There's other obvious examples of this that are slipping my mind. But well, the whole question about how wholes and parts relate to each other.
Hmm.
And so one of the other projects I'm working on besides the natural theology has been to provide Aristotelian interpretation or an Aristotelian framework for making sense of modern science,
Hmm.
particularly quantum mechanics,
Yeah. Right. Right.
where I think that quantum mechanics actually completely reverses the scientific revolution from a philosophical point of view. So the scientific revolution in the 17th century, is basically atomism.
Hmm.
It's all determined by those little tiny particles moving around
Yep.
space. And most of my colleagues still think that way, but quantum mechanics, which has been around for 100 years now, says that's completely wrong, right?
Hmm.
That wholes determine their parts in many cases. And that's exactly what Aristotle thought. And then
Yeah.
also that you need to talk about potentialities as well as actualities, and that's again a key Aristotelian idea.
Yeah. That's right. And yeah, do you have a book coming out on that?
I've got one that came out a couple years ago.
Okay, that's right. Tell us the
So
title so I can link it.
it's a really long title.
All right.
It's Is Thomas Aquinas' Philosophy of Nature Obsolete?
Yeah,
And
that's
it's
right.
it's by St. Augustine Press. So I ended up
Mhm.
just
Yeah.
it's one
Yeah,
nice
because
thing about
that.
it is it's one of the most inexpensive of my books. So that's
Oh,
good.
good.
I think it's like $19 or something.
All right. Well, the what's interesting about that is quantum mechanics, and specifically something like Schrodinger's cat or the Copenhagen school of quantum mechanics, was sufficient for all the analytic atheists I know to abandon the law of non-contradiction.
Hmm.
They're willing to say, no, that law of non-contradiction can't be true universally because quantum mechanics, instead of doing what you're doing and saying, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. There must be something
Yeah.
else going on here, and finding a
Yeah.
solution.
Well, I think people have moved past that. So there was a little boomlet in that kind of quantum logic again back in the 70s, 80s. But actually, even the atheist philosophers of science now don't say that.
Good for
So
them. All right.
so but there are very well. There's two models that they like. One is the many worlds thing, which
Yeah,
is
that's
pretty
right.
crazy actually,
Mhm.
and the other
But
one is
makes
the
it into our
Bohmian
movies.
view. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, and the other one is the Bohmian mechanics where, um, but that requires really radical action at a distance.
Mhm.
So
Yeah,
what's going on at the other side of the universe can
right.
immediately affect what's going on right here
Yeah,
and
isn't that?
now.
Yeah.
And that has all kinds of disturbing impact. So what's interesting is that I mean, there are literally 18 maybe interpretations of quantum mechanics out there
Yeah.
now. And that just goes to show you that the situation has changed. There was
Hmm.
only one interpretation of Newton and Maxwell.
Yeah.
There weren't different philosophical
Hmm.
interpretations. But quantum mechanics poses these problems. I think they're problems for materialism, actually.
Yeah, I think
And
so.
that's why you
Yeah.
get these crazy solutions to try
Yeah.
to salvage some scraps of materialism against this juggernaut of quantum mechanics. And if we discovered quantum mechanics in the 17th century, this is my counterfactual history, right? People said, "Oh yeah, easy form, substantial form, substances, and so on." So it would have immediately there would have been no paradoxes to resolve.
Yeah.
It would have had the resources to make sense of it, but all those resources have been abandoned, and
Yeah.
so then quantum mechanics comes along and they don't know what to do. They're
Yeah. I
they're
do wonder. We
offline.
don't have to go down this path because I'm just thinking off the top of my head here, but the debate between Newton and Cartesians was over something similar in the sense that Cartesians demanded physical causation. Each thing had to bump something next to it to eventually bump the thing down there, whereas
Yeah,
the Newtonians were willing to say there's something called forces.
yeah.
And they were accused by the Cartesians of being occultists.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly. They were actually bringing Aristotle back
yeah.
already. Yeah, that's right. So even once you have gravity, and especially once you get electromagnetism,
Mhm.
already you're on the path back to Aristotle.
Yeah.
And
And Newton even says in this General Scholium that he's measured gravity. He's not sure what it is, but it
mhm,
might even be the activity of God.
yeah, right. Yeah, and or at least it's again something not reducible to the strictures of materialism.
Yeah,
Right?
right.
Not really. So yeah, Descartes had the right idea. If you're going to be a materialist, this is what you have to do.
Yeah.
And then that turned out to be falsified.
Yeah.
So the actual lesson here was atomism was false. Science tells
Yeah.
us it's false.
And so
And
it's a vindication for, I think, classical theism also. And you're someone who's working in classical theism. So we've mentioned a few
yeah,
other Christian philosophers, but they're not classical theists. Tell us what's attractive to you about classical theism besides the fact that you're an Orthodox Christian.
yeah. Well, that's a big part of it, of course.
Yeah.
That raises the prior probability of it for me a lot. I mean, I always found the idea that God was somehow trapped in time sort of bizarre, and it smacks of like almost a kind of polytheism in a way, as though
Yeah.
time is God's consort that He's, you know, working with over the course of eternity. So that, but but as you think about these cosmological, these first cause type arguments, I think, and again, you have this idea, okay, so anything that's causable has a cause. There can't be any circles of causation or infinite regresses. And this is a whole other story. I've done some work on that in the last 10 years or so. So we can maybe get into that too. Well, anyway, let me finish that first
Yeah.
thought.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So this gets you to a first cause, right? But everything causable has to have a cause. So the first cause must be uncausable.
Mhm.
And then what does that mean? What does it mean for something to be uncausable? It has to have a nature which is such, or an essence or something like that, which is such that it couldn't in principle be caused, right? But if something's in time and it's changing in time, right? Then you can really conceive of it as having a beginning in time, right?
Mhm.
If it's a temporal thing, and then it could have a cause. So anything temporal already is disqualified, I think, from being a first cause.
Yeah.
For similar reasons, I think God has to be simple,
Yeah.
since he can't have any parts, right?
Yeah.
Because if he had parts, you can always imagine something causing those parts to glom together. Right?
Right.
And so the first cause must not be like that, right? I'd say that also God shouldn't be finite in any way, in any
Mhm.
respect. At least not in the sense of having some measurable degree
Right.
of intelligence or power or whatever. Because again, if he had an IQ of exactly 16 trillion, right? You could say, well, what caused him to have that IQ and not
Mhm.
16 trillion and one or 16 trillion
Yeah.
minus one, right? But if he has, in fact, it ultimately pushes you, I think, to Thomas's view, which he expresses most clearly in his early work on being in essence,
Yeah.
this simple God is actually a God who's identical to his own active existence. So what that means, I have to unpack that a bit, but what that means is that God is an instance of pure, unadulterated existence,
Mhm.
unlimited existence, right? So because if he had any kind of limitations, a nature like yours and mine, in which being is contracted to the limitations of our nature, then that requires a cause to explain what adds existence to this limited nature.
Right.
Whereas God is just pure unadulterated existence. There's no contraction. There's no
Hmm.
combination of an existence with a nature. His nature just is existence, right? So I think that's quite an attractive picture, I think. And
Yeah.
this is again going back to our early story. This is something that Scotus rejects. So he thinks it's too hard to understand what that means.
Hmm.
And so he substitutes for simplicity, he substitutes infinity. Whereas for Aquinas, you go to first to simplicity, and then you get all these other attributes,
Yeah.
actually. For Scotus, you avoid simplicity altogether, goes right to infinity, and that in some ways is the precursor again of a Swinburne or a Plantinga or someone like that who
Right.
takes God just to be infinite intelligence, infinite so on, which he is, of course. But that's for Thomas, all that flows from the fact that
Yeah.
he's absolute existence,
Yeah.
unlimited existence.
And I'm in the Reformed world, and we've got
Yeah,
some that debate that point. Although I don't
yeah,
know how you can if you hold to the Westminster Confession, because it explicitly says God is simple,
yeah,
not composed of parts. But
yeah,
there's some who would say, well, it sounds like they would in the Catholic side of things, they would be with Duns Scotus, and they would say, well, that's
yeah,
not found in the Bible. And I think it comes out of arguing from the presuppositionalist view and what I call solo scriptura, not sola scriptura, but
yeah, right.
only the Bible is a source. If you can't find a sentence that says it, then it's
Yeah,
not true. But of course,
yeah,
that raises a lot of problems that Reformed people want to believe, like the Trinity. There's no sentence in the Bible that says that, or the dual nature of
exactly.
Christ. So simplicity is one over the last 10 years that's given some Reformed theologians and apologists problems, but there's also been a lot of retrieval to counter that, to say, no, this is the correct view. This is classical theism. Christianity's classically theist. And so I think that's
Yeah,
been important work. And what you've been doing is part of that also.
yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I think this is definitely something that's shared by Catholics, Orthodox, and we might call magisterial Protestants,
Yeah.
Lutherans, Reformed people, and so on. And no one during the Reformation thought that they were opening the door to non-standard views of God, let's
Yeah.
say, the kind that you find nowadays.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and so
so,
coming back to the kind of the five ways and Aristotle,
yeah,
if I had my perfect world, I would have Aristotle minus what I call the Egyptian parts.
uh-huh,
And
right,
that's the same kind of thing with Plato. What I mean by that is
yeah,
Aristotle just assumes the material world existed from eternity, doesn't really
right.
argue about that.
Well,
And so,
he gives some not very great arguments for it.
yeah,
I
yeah,
think.
yeah.
As Thomas pointed out,
Mhm,
points out these are
yeah.
not really very good arguments.
But then I think that's the other thing. If I had my perfect world, I'd have Aquinas, but minus that part specifically about the material world, because
Yeah,
he and then Averroa for the Muslims agree reason really can't show us. We have to have revelation.
yeah,
And at that point, it's like, no, come on, guys, you can do
yeah.
better than that.
Yeah, so I'm in a kind of a complicated relationship to this question, right?
Mhm.
Up until maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I would have just been completely with Aquinas and Averroes here and said,
Mhm.
of course, well, in case of
Mhm.
Thomas, he would say, well, of course, the universe did in
Yeah.
fact have a beginning. We know that from Revelation, but natural theology is got to be agnostic on this question,
Mhm.
because God could have created a beginningless universe if he wanted to. Um, I'm now not convinced that that's right. And I think there are better arguments against the infinity of the past than were available to Thomas at the time.
Mhm.
Um, there's, I rely heavily on this little book by an American philosopher named Jose Benedetti called
Hmm.
Infinity. It's from 1964, totally ignored by most people.
Yeah, I want to look it up. I
Really,
haven't heard it.
really interesting book. So much fun. He just thinks up, there might be 50 little thought experiments that lead to paradox involving infinity. And one that really got me going was one called the Grim Reaper paradox.
Hmm.
Um, and in this paradox, as Benedict describes it, you pack all these Grim Reapers into a single minute.
Hmm.
So there's an infinite number of them. They're all going to kill some victim. And Reaper number one has got a deadline, literally, of 12:01. So if he's still alive at 12:01, one will kill him. Two has 30 seconds after midnight. Three has 15 seconds. Four has 7.5, and
Hmm.
so on. So as you go through time, there's no first Grim Reaper, right?
Hmm.
There's the number one is the last Grim Reaper, temporally speaking, right? And so you can sort of prove that obviously the victim will not survive because if he managed to get through all the rest of them, one would
Yeah.
kill him, so he's definitely dead. But you can also prove that no particular Grim Reaper could kill him,
Yep.
because in order to get Grim Reaper N, he's got to get past N plus one, N plus two, N plus three, and
Yep.
so on. He can't do that either, right? So you get, it's not just you get something weird, you get a contradiction
Hmm.
out of the story, right?
It's very
And you
much
can
as one of a formula of Zeno's paradoxes. It's
It's
one of
related to
those.
Zeno.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're Zeno-like in some ways.
Because I think
And then you can easily adapt this to an infinite past. So you can imagine you've got Grim Reaper 1 at 1 BC, 2 at 2 BC, 3 and 3 BC, and so on, all the way back to an infinite past.
yeah.
In this case, they pass a piece of paper forward. And there's different variations. I was just thinking about the other day. You could just imagine that each one takes a paper from the predecessor and adds one to it, right?
Hmm.
And passes it on to the next one. So, is there a number at the end? Well, of course, because if somehow something went wrong, Grim Reaper 1 would at least add 1 to 0 and we'd
Yeah.
have a number on it. But if you ask, well, what number is it? There's no possible answer,
Yeah.
right? So it makes, in fact, you get a contradiction, right? So it takes what
What's the
had
one William
been
Lane Craig likes? The Herbert
Hilbert
Hotel.
Hotel. Yeah. So this sort of illustrates, I think, the problem with the traditional
Yeah.
Kalam arguments, I think. So the Hilbert Hotel, it was an idea actually invented by David Hilbert, a mathematician. Mathematicians generally love infinity, of course, especially since Cantor. So you imagine a hotel that's got infinitely many rooms in it. And it turns out that it never has to put up a no vacancy sign, because even if every room is full, if you were to arrive, you can just send everybody to the next room over. So and one goes to two, two goes to three, three goes to four, and so on. And now room one is empty. And even if you have an infinite bus arriving with infinitely many people, you can still accommodate all of them in the full hotel. You send everybody from room one to from room N to 2N. So now
Yeah.
you move everybody to even numbered rooms. All the odd number rooms are free, right? So William Lane Craig says that's crazy. That shows that infinity is impossible. But of course, the opponents will say, no, it just shows that crazy things happen when you're dealing with infinities, right?
Yeah.
You're relying on intuitions that we derive from the finite case and applying to the infinite case. So it doesn't actually get a contradiction, right, from that story.
I got you. Yeah.
At least not obviously. Whereas the Benedetti-like paradoxes, you can derive an actual contradiction.
Hmm.
There's
Yeah.
yeah.
So
Anyway,
that for you sort of moved you then towards saying we can give arguments the material universe had a beginning.
yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah, one of
And
the very
so
first
Thomas may
Christian
have been wrong on
one
this
of the very
point.
first Christian philosophers, not just apologists, but actual philosophers, was Johannes Philoponus, and that was his book
Yeah.
that he wrote,
Hmm.
which was
Yeah.
against Aristotle and the eternality of the world. Now, in other
Yeah.
ways, he was an Aristotelian, but
Yeah.
on that point, he thought,
Right.
no, we can prove Aristotle wrong about that.
Yeah. Yeah. And there have been a lot of people since then who thought that. I mean, Al-Ghazali in the Kalam tradition, but also Bonaventure and
Mhm.
others. So yeah, I think. Uh, I mean, again, you might argue, Thomas might argue that these arguments I've given against the infinite past don't count as demonstrations by a strict Aristotelian standard, even if they're persuasive.
Yeah,
Um, so that's a little wiggle room there that a Thomas could give, I think, and
yeah,
still say Thomas wasn't really wrong. He just had this really strict notion of a
yeah.
demonstration.
Well, it
Um,
seems like at least this much is what gets me is really the essence of any pagan system is some version of denying creation. So you're going to have some version of the eternality of the world, because even when you say the world came from chaos, chaos is just disordered stuff that already existed.
right,
So you got these two systems, the Moses system, call it in Genesis,
right.
and then the pagan system. So at least my intuition is that means we should be able to show the pagan one's false.
Well, okay. So let me play devil's advocate for a bit.
Yeah, do it.
So
This is what everyone's been waiting for.
um, because I mean, Thomas would have said, no. I mean, I'm not denying that creation is
Mhm.
necessary, right?
Yeah.
The universe had to be created. The question is, could God have created a beginningless universe
Yeah.
as well as a universe that began? So for him, and I think he's right about this, God's creation, at least from the point of view of God, is not something that occurs at a point in time, so to speak. It's an act that's eternal, so to speak,
Yep.
by God, and it
Or any
produces
time comes into existence, right? Like what
right.
Augustine said at that point. Yeah.
Right, exactly. That I think any sort of classical theist should say that, right?
Hmm.
Should say that time comes into existence, and then like William Lane Craig, I don't understand his view actually. His view is that is that God did create time, and then having created time, then God
Yeah.
somehow enters into time and
Yeah.
becomes temporal. And it's like, wait a minute, how can something eternal and
I
essentially
know.
changeless change in such a way that it becomes changeable? Right? It
Yep.
doesn't make any sense to me. So that I don't understand that. But at least he doesn't think, well, like Swinburne does, that time is just there forever and is independent of God, right?
Yeah.
Not
I heard
created by God, just
I just a story about Swinburne I thought was really fascinating was I was at Oxford a few months after he had an event at the SCP, and I'd reached out to him and he invited me over actually for coffee. We were sitting having coffee, and he told me this really interesting story when he became a philosopher of religion and he came up with these ideas about God changing. Peter Geach wrote him a letter and
hmm.
said, "You've abandoned the faith of your fathers. You need to
Wow.
repent
Yeah.
and turn around." And I thought, wow, that's amazing. Good for Geach.
Yeah. Yeah, Geach was a no nonsense kind of guy. No, I think that's right. So again, so Thomas' view is an eternal, unchanging God, right? Who by this eternal act of creation brings into being time. And now the question is, the time that he brings into being, does it have to have a big starting point, or could it have an infinite past? And Thomas thought, well, he thought that at least he didn't know any way to show that it had to have a beginning of time. Now, here's where I think I disagree with him. Now, I would say no. I think we probably have good reason to think it has a beginning of time. But
Yeah.
to me that's not really the fundamental question, right? The more fundamental question is there a timeless first cause of time,
Right.
right? And then, what exactly the structure of time, possible structure of time is a further question, a very interesting question,
Mhm.
but maybe not the one that carries the theological baggage that I think you
Right.
think it
Yeah, I think
does
that's right. Yeah.
carry. Yeah. So that's
Yeah, I
probably where
think,
we
I mean, my
disagree.
view would be, one of the meanings of eternal is without a beginning. And then you'll have
Yes.
some people who will say you could have eternal without a beginning, but still changing. And I think
Yeah, that's
once we
Swinburne. Yeah.
explore that, I think we'd
Yeah.
find some problems with that. That if you're
Yeah.
eternal, you're not changing.
Yeah.
So if that's true, then there would be problems in saying you have a beginningless but changing universe. If that's true. So I'm not the other side. So that's one part.
So,
The other part of
well,
it
wait,
is
but I
then you're
mean,
at least saying there's two co-eternal things,
so
even if
there's two
God's more
ways. I would
powerful.
say there's two ways to be beginningless, right? One way would be to be in time, but to have no beginning in time, to
Mhm.
stretch back infinitely far to the
Yeah.
past. And the other way is just to be beyond time altogether, be
Yep.
non-temporal, right? And I would say that God is beginningless in that second sense.
Me too. Yeah, 100%. But I think I'm just
Yeah,
suggesting I think we can show that that other kind involves contradictions, and that's an important
yeah.
part of showing that the material universe is not eternal, and also my own soul is not eternal,
I mean,
because
it's
the pagans
yes,
also thought our souls had existed without a beginning.
right, right. No, I agree. No, I agree. So I think from an apologetic point of view, these new wave column arguments that I like are very helpful, right? Because if we can take away the eternal physical universe or the eternal soulish universe from the atheist, where are they going to go next, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it concentrates the mind, as G.K.
Yeah, that's
Chesterton
right.
put it,
Good.
right? Or
Yeah. Now,
yeah,
Fesser's put out a book on the five ways, and what I thought he did well was sometimes the atheist will attack them individually,
yeah,
and I do think there's something to that, just in at least of the appearances, so to speak. That if you go from first cause the to Yahweh, you've got a lot. Wait, we got to make some
right,
steps here.
yeah,
Well,
right,
what he does is he shows how well the five arguments weren't meant to be taken that way.
yeah,
He Aquinas fills in how we get from the first cause to
yeah.
God, and I think that's
I mean,
important because
yeah,
it fills out that story. And I know you do the same work. I'm not bringing it up to compare you guys, but
yeah,
to say you're doing something similar.
yeah. In our book on the five ways that we're working on, Dan Bonevac and I, um, we've got obviously five chapters on each of the five ways, one on each of the five ways, but then we've got another about eight chapters, six or seven, eight chapters that go through the questions, which are themselves fairly long, that follow the five ways,
Yeah, well, that's
the
good.
next
Yeah.
20 or so questions. So it's hundreds of articles, right, arguments that Thomas goes through in order to get to all the divine attributes. So
Yeah.
he doesn't think the first way does all that for us.
Exactly.
He
Yeah.
thinks he gives us the crucial starting point um,
Yep.
to do the work that follows.
Well, and yeah, and so for someone like Hume, when you look at his dialogues,
Yeah,
Philo's objection to Cleanthes, and
yeah,
Cleanthes is the one who uses the cosmological argument. And his objection is that, well, maybe there are other analogies like the universe is a vegetable or it's an
Yeah.
animal.
So I would no, I would say Cleanthes is using, I would say, more of a
Yeah.
design-like
Okay.
argument,
Yeah.
right? Actually, it's Demia who does it's like a one-page version of the
Yeah.
cosmological argument.
Well,
It's
what
borrowed
he
from
says,
Samuel
yeah, what he
Clarke.
says is he wants an a priori argument. So it might even be closer
Yes.
to an ontological.
Well,
But you're
right.
right.
This is he's confused on this point, I
Yeah,
think,
right.
actually. Yeah,
Yeah.
because I think the cosmological argument isn't really a
Yeah,
priori.
right. Yeah.
It does require something to exist that we know empirically in some sense. So it has a kind of minimal empirical
Yep.
starting point. Um,
But I
so
think
yeah,
the reason I brought them up is I
yeah,
think what you just said about Aquinas would have answered that.
yes, right, right, and also again in dismissing Demia's argument, again Hume relies heavily on his theory
Hmm.
of epistemology and metaphysics.
Yeah.
So he just rejects the idea that there could be a necessity that's not a conceptual necessity.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and actually, it's not entirely his fault because Christian philosophers, including Samuel Clarke and Leibniz, were moving in that direction too, and Descartes. They all were sort of thinking in terms of, not in terms of what I would call metaphysical possibility and necessity as a thing out there in the world, but just in terms of what was conceptually
Yeah.
conceivable by us.
100%. Yeah,
Right?
that's
Mm.
Hume even says that if you can conceive it, it's possible.
Yes,
And
right.
so, for example, one of my professors said there's a possible world that's only ping pong balls
Right.
because he
Yeah.
could imagine a huge number of ping pong balls. And I said, well,
Right.
that means it's a purely material world. There's nothing
Yeah.
else
Yeah.
in it.
That's right.
So besides the ping pong ball part, what you're really saying is there's a possible world with only matter, and that raises a number of problems actually. But
Yeah.
if you just think about ping pong balls, you can get away with it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think and that of course leads also to his dismissing of causation as something real in the world.
Yeah.
So that also becomes just a kind of projection of our own inclinations or something onto the data.
Yeah,
Um,
I saw Elon Musk tweeted out a cartoon today that had in the first square two people talking and it said one of them said, "I used to believe in causation, but after I took my sociology class, it really helped me understand correlation." And the next square, the person says, "So the class caused you to change your mind, huh?"
yeah, right, exactly. No, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. I mean, even if you truly try to make sense of Hume's account, it's got all kinds of notions in it,
Yeah.
right? The idea that we get accustomed to certain kind of repetition of a pattern. We start expecting it. Wait, we're accustomed? What does that mean? That means we develop a habit. What does that mean? That means that the pattern affects us in a certain way, right? It makes
Mhm.
our minds work a certain way. So the whole account already is inextricably tied up with causation. So
Yeah.
you can't really get rid of it, in fact.
Yeah, there was an interesting book. I don't know how much to put into this, except for it is fascinating to me that in the dialogues, Hume brings up Hindu philosophy on two
Hmm.
occasions and seems to know
Sure.
about specific philosophers. But there was a book about how when he was in France, he studied with Jesuits, the same ones where Descartes would have been. And it
Hmm.
does make me wonder how much
That.
awareness he had of particularly Buddhist philosophy, which seems so similar to his radical empiricism.
Yeah. That's a really good question. I have no idea. I
Yeah, I
didn't
don't
even
know
know
either.
that.
I don't
I didn't
know.
even
I
know he
wouldn't want to
studied with
do it. I'm not
Jesuits.
doing
That's
genetic
interesting.
fallacy, but just
Yeah, right.
the
No,
interesting
just
fact of those similarities.
right. No, that would be interesting to look at. Yeah. No, there are definitely some similarities there. You're right. Yeah.
Yeah, but
The
I want to
the
thank
the
you.
the, the skepticism about the self, right? That's
Yeah, just that the
yeah.
self that there's no
Yeah.
causation, there's just
Yeah.
moments.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, but hey, I want to
Right.
thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, sure. My
You
pleasure.
explained some very deep ideas to us in an understandable way. So I appreciate that, and I'm
Great.
looking forward to your new book that's coming out.
Great. Well, thanks for having me. I've enjoyed it a lot.